G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session 2 of Angelology, the doctrine of elect angels. Remember, we're only dealing with the good angels at this time. We'll deal with with Satan and the demonic realm in the next sessions. Last session, what are some of the things that we did learn? Well, we learned for a start that angels are immortal. We also learned that angels don't have wings, contrary to popular belief. They always appear as young men. We also found out that 1/3 of them failed the test in obedience to God, and 1/3 of them followed Satan with his fall also. So the remaining 2/3 of the angelic host, they can no longer sin because they're now confirmed in their holiness, confirmed in their holy state. The Bible only mentions 2 good angels. That's Michael, who is the archangel. He's the one over all the other angels, and he's also the prince. He is the prince. And he's the Prince of Israel. He is in charge of the nation of Israel. We also see Gabriel. He also is another good angel, and he's the one who brings the message to the nation of Israel. He's the one who reveals things to the nation of Israel. So today we're going to continue on with the angelic realm. So we did see also that there's a hierarchy in the angelic realm. We have at the top of the tree, we had the cherubim, and we had the seraphim, and then we had the angels. Angels were the lowest order. Okay. So now we're going to look at the seraphim. This is the second order of celestial beings. The term seraphim is the plural of the Hebrew word seraph, which means a burning one. Now, seraphim are mentioned in only 2 books, and that's Isaiah and Revelation. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, the term is also translated as serpent or snake or fiery serpents, and we find that in Numbers 21, verse 8, Isaiah 14:29, and Isaiah 30, verse 6. But we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 6, verses 2-3 and verses 6-7. We can learn several things from this particular book about the seraphim. In verse 2 of Isaiah 6, above him stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, with twain he covered his feet, with twain he did fly. Twain means 2. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is Jehovah of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. In verse 6, then flew one of the seraphim unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he touched my mouth with it and said, Lo, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin forgiven. So this is in the book of Isaiah, and the one whose lips was touched here was Isaiah. So according to these verses, the seraphim surrounded the throne of God. Unlike angels who have no wings, seraphim are described as having 6 wings. Each pair has a different purpose. The purpose of the first pair is for covering their feet. The purpose of the second pair is to cover their faces. The purpose of the third pair is for flying. The verses also reveal that the seraphim praise God to each other continuously, saying over and over and over again, Holy, holy, holy is Jehovah of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So one seraph is described here as purifying the sins of Isaiah in verse 6 by taking a hot coal from off the altar of sacrifice in heaven and placing it upon Isaiah's lips. And at that moment, in verse 7, the prophet's sins were now cleansed. So this is about as much as can be learned from seraphim from the Old Testament. Just these two passages in Isaiah. Now, if we go forward to the book of Revelation, the rest of what we know about the seraphim is found here, where they are mentioned in 8 different passages. First passage is Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 to 11. Now, this states, verse 6, and before the throne, as it were, a sea of glass, like unto crystal. And in the midst of the throne and round about the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes before and behind. And the first creature was like a lion, the second creature like a calf. And the third creature had a face as of a man. Fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, having each one of them 6 wings, are full of eyes round about and within. So this passage gives us 7 truths about seraphim. First of all, it says in verse 6, they surround the throne of God. It says also in verse 6 that they're full of eyes in front and back, symbolizing here that they are able to see far beyond the human realm in order to be able to carry out God's providence. And it says they have 6 wings. Now, they don't all look exactly the same because verse 7 tells us that. Now, while all of them have 6 wings, the distinguishing characteristic of seraphim is differing facial features. And based upon these features, there are 4 categories of seraphim. One is lion-like, one is calf-like, one is man or human-like, and one is eagle-like in their facial features, that is. They're full of eyes all around. Earlier, it was mentioned that they are full of eyes in front and back. Now in verse 8, it is stated that they are full of eyes all the way around, including the sides and within. Now in verse 8, it says, and they have no rest day and night, saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And verse 9 says, when the living creatures shall give glory and honor and thanks to him that sits on the throne, to him that lives forever and ever. The 24 elders shall fall down before him that sits on the throne and shall worship him that lives forever and ever, and shall cast their crowns before the throne, saying, worthy, this is verse 11, worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive the glory and the honor and the power. For you did create all the things, and because of your will they were and were created. So here we see that they continuously praise God and say the same words recorded in Isaiah with a slight variation. Whenever they say holy, 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 it's a signal to the 24 elders that they too must now worship the one who sits upon the throne. And we find it in verses 10 to 11. Now, in this context that we see here, the one sitting upon the throne is God the Father. Second passage we find is Revelation 5, verse 6, where it states, and I saw in the midst of the throne and of the 4 living creatures, and in the midst of the elders, a lamb standing as though it had been slain, having 7 horns, 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. So this verse in chapter 5, verse 6 teaches that the seraphim also surround the Lamb, meaning the Son of God, God the Son. So that's Revelation 5, 6. Now Revelation 5, verse 8 to 10 and verse 14. And when he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having each one a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sing a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the book and to open the seals thereof. For you were slain and did purchase unto God with your blood men of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and made them to be unto our God a kingdom of priests, a kingdom and priests, and they reign upon the earth. Verse 14, and the 4 living creatures says, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshipped. So what we see here is that at some point in the future, the Lamb, the Son of God, will take the 7-seal scroll and break its seals. And this act will then begin the tribulation. So as the Lamb takes the scroll, the seraphim will worship him. Fourth passage we find in Revelation 6, verse 1, 3, 5, and 7. A seraph announces a special seal judgment. The first seraph announces the first seal judgment. Second seraph announces the second seal judgment. Third seraph announces the third seal judgment. And the fourth seraph announces the fourth seal judgment. So, of the 7 seal judgments, the first 4 will be announced by seraphim. The fifth passage is Revelation chapter 7, verses 11 to 12. Now, in this passage, seraphim will be praising God for those who are saved during the Great Tribulation. And in this chapter, chapter 7, the 144,000 Jews will be saved, and myriads of Gentiles will also be saved. And seraphim will be praising God for that purpose or for that reason, because of all those who were saved during the tribulation. The sixth passage we find is Revelation 14, verse 3. They sing, as it were, a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no man could learn the song save the 144,000, even they that had been purchased out of the earth. So here we find that the seraphim were witnessing 144,000 Jewish believers singing a new song in the Messianic kingdom. And then in Revelation 15, verse 7, a seraph will give the 7 bowl judgments to the 7 angels. The bowl judgments of Revelation 15 and 16 are by far the most severe of the tribulation judgments. And it will be a seraph who will hand these 7 bowl judgments to the 7 angels so that these judgments can be poured out upon the earth. And then we have the 8th passage, which is Revelation 19, verses 4 to 5, where seraphim again lead in worship of God. Now, what can we deduct from these things? From the Isaiah and Revelation passages, 8 major truths can be deduced concerning the second order of angels, the seraphim. Seraphim are characterized by unceasing worship of God. They worship both God the Father and God the Son continuously. They're characterized by humility. Why? Because we see, this is pictured by the fact that 2 wings are used to cover their feet and 2 wings are used to cover their faces, for they are standing in the very presence of God and surrounding his throne. They have a ministry of purification of God's servants, so that these servants can also worship and serve the Lord. And this we saw back in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 6 to 7, where the seraph purified the lips of the prophet Isaiah. The seraphim lead worship in heaven, and when they say, holy, 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 all the other inhabitants of heaven, such as the 24 elders, also begin to worship God. Their primary concern is to emphasize the holiness and worship of God. The 6th thing we see here is that they praise and proclaim the holiness of God. They do this each time in a 3-fold way by repeating the word holy 3 times. Now, that may very well be because of the triunity. Holy, 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 as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all holy. That quite possibly could be the reason. They also proclaim that men need to be cleansed, and this cleansing comes by means of the altar where the shedding of blood took place. Now, cleansing is always by means of blood, and today, in this era of grace that we live in, it is by means of the blood of the Messiah. So seraphim will be used for many of the tribulation judgments. God will use seraphim to pour out his wrath on the earth. Now we come to the 3rd order of celestial beings, and these are the cherubim. This is the 3rd and highest order of celestial beings. Hebrew word translated into English as cherub, which is singular of cherubim, is a word called kerub, K-E-R-U-B. It comes from a word that has the root meaning of to guard or to cover. Now, it's used a total of 91 times. 27 times it is in the singular, 64 times it is in the plural. And of these 91 times, 90 of them occur in the Old Testament. There's only one found in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 5. Now, there's some scriptures here. In Genesis 3:24, the cherubim we see guarded the entrance into the Garden of Eden so that Adam and Eve could not get back in. In Exodus 25:18-22, cherubim covered the mercy seat. In Exodus 26, verse 1, figures of cherubim were embroidered into the curtains of the tabernacle. In Exodus 37:7-9, the cherubim covered the mercy seat. In 1 Samuel 4:4 and 2 Samuel 6:2, God is pictured as sitting above the cherubim. According to 2 Samuel 22, verse 11, Jesus the Messiah would be riding a cherub at his coming. In 1 Kings 6:23-28 and 7, verse 29 and 36, cherubim are made for the Holy of Holies of the Solomonic Temple. Now, these cherubim have two wings, each have two wings, the ones we see here in the temple. In 1 Kings 8:6-7, cherubim covered the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. In 2 Kings 19:15 and 1 Chronicles 13:16, it states that God sits above the cherubim. In 1 Chronicles 28, verse 18, they covered the Ark of the Covenant. In 2 Chronicles 3:7, cherubim were engraved in the walls of the temple. In 2 Chronicles 3:10-14, three things are learned. First, they were images of cherubim in the Holy of Holies. Secondly, they each had two wings. And thirdly, they were also embroidered into the veil itself. The veil, this is the veil which separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. In 2 Chronicles 5, verses 7-8, they covered the Ark of the Covenant. In Psalm 18:10, it stated that Jesus the Messiah will be riding a cherub at the second coming. In Psalm 80, verse 1, and Psalm 99, verse 1, and Isaiah 37, verse 16, God sits above the cherubim. Now, the book that gives the most details concerning cherubim is the book of Ezekiel, which explains just how God sits above the cherubim. Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 5-28 gives an extensive description of cherubim. First, it says that their basic likeness is that of a man. That's verse 5 of Ezekiel 1. Secondly, each one has four different faces. We have a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And in this area, they resemble the seraphim. Third, each has four wings, two on each side of the body. We see that in verse 6. Fourthly, their feet are absolutely straight. Verse 7. And the soles of their feet are like the sole of a calf's foot. 6, they sparkle like burnished brass. This is their feet. 7th, they have the hands of a man under their wings on their four sides. 8th, they appear in four ways. First, like burnished brass. Secondly, like burning coals of fire. Third, like torches. And fourthly, fire is in their midst. We see all this in verse 13. And 9th, it says that they travel with the speed of a flash of lightning. 10th, the noise of their wings is like many waters. It's like the voice of God, like the noise of a tremendous army. We see it in verse 24. And 11th, they are connected or closely associated with the Shekinah glory. We see that in verses 26-28. In Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 1-22, the cherubim were involved in the departure of the Shekinah glory from the temple. In Ezekiel 28:14-16, it states that Satan was a cherub when he was created. In fact, he was the anointed cherub. Just as Michael was the archangel, he was the one in authority over all the other angels, Satan was the arch cherub, the one in authority over all the other cherubim. Now, since the cherubim are the highest order, and with Satan's being the arch cherub, this made him of a higher category than Michael. The last place that the cherubim are mentioned in the Old Testament is Ezekiel 41, verses 18 to 20 and verse 25. Now, this passage, Ezekiel 41, speaks of something future. Concerning the future, three things are stated about the cherubim. First, the figure of the cherubim will be engraved on the walls of the millennial temple. Second, these cherubim will have two faces. One face is that of a man, the other face is that of a young lion. And third, they'll also be engraved on the doors of the millennial temple. Now, in the New Testament, Hebrews 9, verse 5 reiterates the teaching of the Hebrew scriptures by stating, "And above it, cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat, of which things we cannot now speak severally." So the mercy seat the cherubim overshadowed was that of the tabernacle. Now, what can we find out from these passages? Well, from these passages, we can find 7 major truths can be deduced. First, there are 3 different types or categories of cherubim. First, there are those who have only one face and 2 wings. Secondly, those who have 2 faces and 2 wings. And thirdly, those who have 4 faces, 4 wings. It's never stated exactly which kind of cherub Satan is, but we know that he is in one of these 3 categories. Secondly, these beings are closely related to the throne of God in that they are the ones who carry the throne according to Ezekiel chapter 1. Whereas the seraphim surrounded the throne, the cherubim actually carry the throne and also cover it from above. Now, because the cherubim bear and carry the throne of God, this is the reason why it is stated that God is the one who sits above the cherubim. The cherubim then are closely related to the throne of God. This closer proximity to the throne itself is a reason they are of a higher order than the seraphim. Thirdly, they're very closely related to the Shekinah glory. Now, to a great extent, they reflect the Shekinah glory. They were involved in the departure of the Shekinah glory from Israel in 586 BC, before the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Fourthly, the cherubim are closely related to God's presence, and this is closely tied into the Shekinah glory connection here. The Shekinah glory, remember, it's the visible manifestation of God's presence. Cherubim are very closely related to the presence of God. The fifth thing we see is that they are concerned with God's justice and might. While the seraphim were concerned with the worship and holiness of God, the cherubim are concerned with the justice, power, and might of God. 6, they defend God's holy character and presence, which is a reason why they need their might. And 7th, they have the ability to carry out swiftly God's will among the nations. Now, this is just a little chart here, just provides a visual aid to understand the order of celestial beings. We have the cherubim, we have the seraphim, we have angels. Satan is the arch cherub, he is the one over all the cherubs. Michael is the archangel, he's the one over all the angels. So cherubs are of higher authority than angels. Now, what are the works of angels? The works of angels we're going to look at in 7 different categories. In relation to God, as agents of revelation in the life of the Messiah, among the nations, among unbelievers, in relation to believers, and in the future. Now, what's their work in relation to God? Now, one of the ministries of angels in relation to God is that they are employed in his worship. They are seen as actively worshiping God in Psalm 29, verses 1 to 2, and Psalm 103, verse 20, 148, verse 2, and also in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3. We also see them in the New Testament in Hebrews 1, verse 6, and Revelation 4, 8 to 11, and 5, 8 to 13. Now, the Revelation 4 passage speaks of their worship of God the Father, while the Revelation 5 passage speaks of their worship of God the Son. Secondly, they execute God's will. God's will is often carried out by means of angels. Again, we see this in Psalm 103, verse 20, where it says that they fulfill his word. In Hebrews 1:7, it says that they're his ministers, a flame of fire. Third thing we see is that angels rejoice in the work of God. When God created the heavens and the earth, the angels shouted for joy, and you can find it back in Job chapter 38, verse 7. And when God saves an individual, there is joy among the angels. We find it in Luke 15, verse 10. Fourthly, angels are seen executing God's judgment. In Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 to 22, they were used to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. In Exodus 12, verse 22, they were used in connection with the 10th plague in Egypt. In 1 Chronicles 21:15, they were used in connection with the pestilence in Israel. Revelation chapter 7, verse 1 and chapter 8, verse 2 tells us the winds ceased because of these angels. And then we have the 7 trumpets with the 7 angels. And now, as angels of revelation, this is the second category of the work. Moses did receive some of the Lord directly, but much of it was mediated to him by means of angels. And this is hinted at in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. It was actually part of rabbinic tradition. And not all rabbinic traditions are verified by the New Testament, but in this case, it can be seen in Acts chapter 7, verse 53, Galatians 3:19, and Hebrews 2:2. They all said that the angels mediated the law to Moses. Also, Daniel often received his revelation directly from God, but some of his material, such as Daniel chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 12, verse 13, came by means of angels also. So they're God's agents of revelation. Same thing is true of Zechariah. Zechariah's book has 14 chapters, but the first 6 of these chapters, chapter 1, verse 7 to 6:15, actually came by means of angels. And the book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John, well, that was mediated and revealed to him by means of an angel, according to Revelation 1 to 3, Revelation 10, 1 to 11, 17, 1, 19, 9 to 10, 21, 19, and 22, 16. There they are on the PowerPoint. So God used an angel to reveal the book of Revelation. What about the work of angels in the life of the Messiah? Well, this is it. We see here angels were used in 5 specific instances in the life of Messiah. The first one was the time of his birth and early life. In regard to his birth, it was the angel Gabriel who predicted the birth of Messiah to Mary. And that we find in Luke 1, 26 to 38. And also he predicted it to Joseph in Matthew 1, 20 to 23. Angels were also used in Luke 2, 8 to 15 to announce the birth of the Messiah to the Jewish shepherds just outside of Bethlehem. It was also an angel who warned Joseph in Matthew 2, 13 to flee Bethlehem, and an angel actually told Joseph in Matthew 2, 19 to 20 to leave Egypt and to return to Israel. What about the ministry of Jesus? Well, in Psalm 91, 1 to 12, Psalm 91, 1 to 12 predicted that angels would be used throughout the ministry of the Messiah. And Paul affirmed this in a general statement in 1 Timothy 3, verse 16, when he said that the Messiah was seen of angels throughout his ministry. When Jesus was tempted, angels were used to minister to him in his temptations. And we find it in Matthew 4, verse 1 and Mark 1, verse 13. Now, also throughout his ministry, angels were ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. And we find it in John chapter 1, verse 51. They ministered to Jesus during his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. We find it in Luke 22, verse 43. And finally, according to Matthew 26, verse 53, there were more than 12 legions of angels ready to defend Jesus at his trial if he needed them for any purpose, which of course he didn't need them. The third period of his life when angels were used was in connection with the resurrection. It was an angel who rolled away the stone from the tomb, we find in Matthew 28, verse 2. Angels were used to announce the resurrection to the women who came to the tomb. Again, we find in Matthew 28, 1-7, corresponding passages in Mark 16, 5-7, Luke 24, 4-7, and John 20, verse 12-13. The fourth period angels were used in the life of the Messiah was at the ascension. After he ascended, angels announced that this same Jesus, who was then departing, would come again in like manner. We find in Acts chapter 1, verses 10-11. Now, the phrase in like manner means that just as he left in the clouds of heaven, he will someday return in the clouds of heaven. Now we see them also involved in Messiah's second coming. This is a future role for the angels here. Angels will come with Messiah in the clouds of heaven at his second coming. And this is found in Matthew 16, verse 27, 24, verse 31, and also 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 7. So even in the future, angels will be involved in the life of the Messiah. The fourth category concerns the work of angels among the nations. Now, here, two things should be mentioned. First of all, angelic beings function in the capacity of cosmocrats, which means world rulers or rulers of nations. In Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, for example, Daniel mentions a leading angelic being. He mentions the prince of the kingdom of Persia. So Michael, the archangel, not only has authority over other angels, but also happens to be the chief prince over Israel, over the nation of Israel. And we find it in Daniel chapter 10, verse 21 and Daniel 12, verse 1. Angels are also closely associated with the humans who rule over specific nations. In Isaiah chapter 14, verses 3-20, we have a good example there. In this passage, Isaiah mentioned the human king of Babylon in verses 3-11, Isaiah 14. And then he turned his attention to Satan in verses 12-14, followed by a renewed mention of the king of Babylon in verses 15-20. Same thing we find in Ezekiel 28, 1-19, which speaks about Tyre, Tyre. Verses 1-10 speak of the human prince of Tyre, while verses 11-19 are addressed to Satan as the king of Tyre. Now, because both fallen and unfallen angelic beings are used as cosmocrats or world rulers, they carry out God's will among the nations. Now, many things happened among nations that happen among nations are due to these angelic beings. Quite frequently, the reason nations go to war against one another is because they have been moved to do so by these cosmocratic angelic beings. Now, angels, what do they do amongst the unbelievers? Well, angels announce impending judgment. This is another work that they do among unbelievers. This was done historically back in Genesis 19, verses 12-13, when angels announced the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, in the future, they're going to do it again. They're going to announce the terrible bowl judgments in the future. We find it in Revelation chapter 14, verses 6-7. Now, among the unbelievers, they also inflict punishment. Angels were used to inflict punishment in the past. For example, it was an angel who carried out the 10th plague upon the firstborn sons of the Egyptians back in Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. Other examples we find are in 2 Samuel 24:16 and Ezekiel 9, 1-8. New Testament example is Acts 12:23, where an angel was used to smite Herod Agrippa with a fatal disease. Now, what they've done in the past, they'll also do in the future. Angels will also inflict punishment in the tribulation period. And you can find that in Revelation 8, 1-2, verse 6, and also chapter 16, verse 1. In the future, angels are going to act as reapers. And this is at the end of the tribulation. They'll act as reapers. As reapers, they'll separate believers from unbelievers. You can find that in Matthew 13, verse 39-42 and 49-50. In verse 39, it says the harvest, Jesus speaking here says the harvest is the end of the age and the reapers are angels. And then in 49-50, it's again, so will it be at the end of the age, Jesus talking, the angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, their work in relationship to believers. The Bible has a lot to teach on this subject. Now, from the many passages of scripture that speak of the work of angels in relationship to believers, 10 things we're going to look at here. First of all, in regard to believers' salvation, these good angels rejoice when one is saved. Now, fallen angels do not rejoice when one is saved, but the elect, the holy angels, do rejoice at one's salvation. You can find that in Luke 15, verse 10. Second thing has to do with the believer's guardianship. In relation to believers, angels have a guardianship. They carry out general protective care. Psalm 34, verse 7 and Psalm 91, verse 11 teach that nothing can happen to a believer outside of God's will because of the general protective care of angels. Now, these verses do not teach that nothing bad can happen to believers, but that nothing can happen outside of God's will. When bad things happen to a believer, it is not because the angels were failing at their job, but that this was God's permissive will. God permitted this to happen. Now, Matthew chapter 18, verse 10 also teaches us that all children have guardian angels. And in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, that states that every believer has a guardian angel as well. In fact, as soon as one is saved, he has a guardian angel assigned to him. Now, angels are often used to save or rescue believers from specific situations. So they're involved in believers' safety. For example, angels were used in Genesis 19, 1-22 to rescue Lot. In Genesis 32, 1-2, angels were used to aid Jacob. In 1 Kings 19, 5-6, an angel was used to feed the prophet Elijah. In 2 Kings 6, verse 17, angels protected Elisha. In Daniel 3, 24-28, an angel protected the 3 friends of Daniel in the fiery furnace. And in Daniel 6, verse 22, an angel shut the mouths of lions so that no harm came to Daniel the prophet. In Acts 5, 17-20, an angel rescued the apostles. Finally, an angel rescued Peter in Acts 12, 6-11. So they're busy with regard to the believer's safety. Now, believers' guidance is another area that they are also involved in. And this is they guide believers into truth and actions. For example, in Matthew chapter 1, verses 20-21, an angel instructed Joseph to believe Mary's story, that she really was a virgin, even though she was pregnant. An angel brought Philip to a situation where he could witness to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, verse 26. In Acts 10, 3-8, an angel instructed Cornelius to send for Peter so that he might preach the gospel to him. The same point is reaffirmed in Acts 11, verses 13-14. In Acts 27, verse 23-24, an angel guided Paul as well. It says, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, And he said to him, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar." The angel told Paul what he had to do. He was going to stand before Caesar, and he wasn't to be afraid. Now, in relation to believers, the fifth work of angels is in regard to answer prayer. Sometimes prayers are answered by means of angels. In the case, for instance, of Daniel, for example, this happened twice in Daniel 9, verses 20 to 23, and Daniel 10, verses 12 to 13. An angel was used in both these instances to answer the prophet's prayer for more revelation. In the New Testament, groups of saints were praying for Peter's release from prison. In answer to their prayers, an angel was used to rescue the apostle. We find it in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 19. The sixth work of angels in relationship to believers is one of encouragement. And again, we find it in Acts chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, and Acts 27, verse 23 to 25. Also, we find that the seventh work of angels in relationship to believers is to carry the soul to its abode, its dwelling place in heaven when a believer dies. And we find it in Luke 16, verse 22. Now, angels also serve as spectators or observers of believers. They have the ministry of observation to see how believers are acting and responding. For example, in Luke 12:18, the faith of a believer is confessed before the angels. Later on in Luke 15, verse 10, angels observe when one is saved. Angels also observe the sufferings of believers. We find it in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9. In 1 Corinthians 11:10, angels observe whether or not women are obedient in wearing the head covering in the church. In 1 Timothy 5, verse 21, angels are present when believers make a commitment to the Lord. Finally, according to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 to 12, angels observe and look into God's work of salvation. So they're observing believers. Now, their ministry in relation to believers is in the area of the local churches. Here they serve as guardians over the local churches. Not only do individual believers have guardian angels, but every local church has a guardian angel. And this is seen in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, where each letter is addressed to the angel of this or that church. So each church has an angel as a guardian over it. Now, in relation to believers, what is the believer's proper attitude toward angels? What should our relation be towards angels in light of what we've just seen, these 9 previous works? Well, 4 things. First of all, believers are allowed to wonder and be amazed at the angel's ability and work, just as Daniel was. We find it back in Daniel 8, verses 16 to 17, and Daniel 10, verses 1 to 9. Secondly, believers can appreciate their ministry. We find it in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14. And third, believers are forbidden to worship angels. We find it in Colossians chapter 2, verse 18, and Revelation 19, verse 10, and Revelation 22, verse 9. The fourth thing is that in the future, believers will judge angels. We find it in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 3. Believers, we're not going to judge the good angels, of course, but it's the fallen angels who will be judged at the great white throne judgment. Yeah, during the tribulation, the angels will perform 7 specific works. After the 144,000 Jews have been sealed, angels will then be used to cause damage upon the earth as part of God's divine judgment. You can find that in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 to 13. 7 angels were used to pour out the 7 trumpet judgments. You can find in Revelation 8, 1 to 9, verse 21, and Revelation 11, verses 15 to 19. Now, in the middle of the tribulation, good angels will be used to cast Satan and the fallen angels out of their present abode, which is in the atmospheric heavens, and they're going to confine them to the earth for the rest of the tribulation period. So the good angels toss them out, and you can find it in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 to 12. Fourth thing is that angels will make certain mid-tribulation announcements. We find it in Revelation 14, verses 6 to 20. And fifth, just as angels were used in the tribulation to pour out the trumpet judgments, angels are going to be also used to pour out the bowl judgments. Again, Revelation 15, 7 to 16, 21. And then sixth, in the tribulation, an angel will be used to pass a sentence of destruction upon the city of Babylon. We find it in Revelation 18, 1 to 3 and 21 to 24. Seventh specific work of angels in the tribulation will be to call the nations to Armageddon so that God can pour out his judgments upon these nations. And that's, you can find in Revelation 19, verses 17 to 18. Now, again, in the future, the second thing we're going to see in the future is their angels' relationship to the second coming. And again, two things we need to look at here. First of all, the good angels will return with Jesus at the second coming. And we find that in Matthew 16, verse 27 and 24, verse 31. Also, Matthew 25, verse 31. You also find it in 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 7. And secondly, also at the second coming, angels will separate believers from unbelievers. And we find this in Matthew 13, 39 to 42 and 49 to 50. That's in their role as reapers. Third division of the work of angels in relationship to the future is their work in conjunction with the Messianic kingdom. Two major truths are taught here. First, it will be a common angel, just an ordinary old angel, who will be given the authority to bind Satan in the abyss for 1,000 years. We find it in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. So the mighty anointed cherub is going to be humbled by the fact that he'll be bound by an unnamed angel of the lowest order. Secondly, the angels will be used to regather the Jews back into the land, and we find it in Matthew 24, verse 31. And for the first time in their history, the Jewish people will be able to enjoy all the promised land has to offer. Now, in the future, we have a look at the eternal order. This is the fourth division of work of angels in the future. This has to do with the eternal state and the eternal order. According to Revelation chapter 21, verse 12, the angels will serve as guardians of the city gates. The New Jerusalem, which will be the eternal abode of all believers of all time, will have 12 gates, 3 on each side of the city. Each gate will be made of a huge pearl, and each will be guarded by an angel. Now, what's the destiny of angels? Well, Hebrews 12, verse 22 states, "But you are come unto Mount Zion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable hosts of angels." So according to this verse, the writer says that believers have come to the city which has the innumerable host of angels. So the destiny of all believers and all unfallen angels, it's the good guys, is one and the same, and that is the New Jerusalem. So all the elect holy angels, those who did not fall with Satan, will have their eternal abode in the New Jerusalem along with us. And that is the end of angelology. Now, when we come to the next section, we'll be looking at the arch cherub as we look at Satanology. Thank you for coming along. That's our contact details there. Study hard and grow strong. Thank you.